Pardon me. Our next debate's about banning smoking. And this is a classic debate of where you have one side trying to show where individuals should be allowed to do whatever they like with their own bodies and interpret the harms for themselves, and another, in this case the proposition, explaining why the government needs to step in order to stop people from hurting themselves. In this debate, you need to look out for the speakers using evidence to try and back up their claims. And also perhaps think about how emotive their language is. Are they rhetorically powerful, or do they do too much and take away from the substance of their arguments?
I now call on the first speaker from the proposition.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, in 2006 the World Health Organization estimated that 26% of male deaths in the developed world were caused by smoking. We on the proposition think that this statistic is terrible and that we need to do something about the dangers that smoking causes people around the world. Tonight we're going to propose banning smoking, and we think that the production, sale and distribution of all tobacco products, including cigarettes, pipes, snuff, anything really that the opposition can think about to do with tobacco should all be banned. Now I think this is a very good idea for a number of reasons. In my speech I'll be talking about the harms of smoking and why we think it's very bad for people's health, why it's particularly bad for vulnerable groups in society, and also how it affects the developing world. What Jess is going to do in her speech is look at the role of government and explain why we think that it's the government's responsibility to take steps here to stop people making the wrong choice, as it were. And she'll also be talking about addiction. So the first argument that I want to bring up is why we think smoking is bad for public health. And it's irrefutable. The evidence has been out there for a long time. In fact, in Italy, they banned smoking in 1590. In Bavaria, they banned it in 1723. And there have now been bans on indoor smoking across the United States and the UK and Western Europe. No, thank you. So we know that smoking kills people, and it will be very difficult in this debate, I think, for the opposition to argue otherwise. Smoking leads to more people dying in Canada than alcohol, cars, murder and illegal drugs combined. Cigarettes contain carcinogenic drugs, bad things in them, hundreds of additives, which lead to people getting diseases like heart disease, asthma, cancer, all things which we think are really, really bad and which we need to protect citizens from having. Yes, please.
Do you not think there are a number of jobs in society that people do that also have health risks, but they can consent to those health harms?
That's an interesting argument, if you think that people are genuinely consenting to continuing to smoke. And what Jess is going to look at in her speech is why we think the cycle of addiction that cigarette manufacturers get people into when they start smoking, the fact that nicotine is so addictive means that they don't genuinely have that kind of choice. But we also think that smoking is very, very bad for vulnerable groups in society. Because essentially, tobacco manufacturers make money out of people who they think are vulnerable and who will take up smoking and continue to smoke. And we see that that has a very negative effect, sometimes on the people who don't smoke, no thank you, who we need to think about in this debate too. Because the US Surgeon General, in a report in 2005, categorically stated that second-hand smoke or passive smoking is a real issue. That somebody could be having a cigarette in a room and someone on the other side of that room will still be inhaling the toxic fumes which that cigarette is producing. And we don't think that it's right in society that we put people like children at risk from second-hand smoke. And that's something, no thank you, which even the indoor public smoking bans can't deal with. We think we need to take serious steps to protect children across the world, because at the moment parents of children the parents who smoke can legally smoke in their own homes with the children watching the television. No thank you. And we don't think that it's right that these kids should be put in a situation where they're in that kind of toxic environment, which is why we need to have a total ban. And the reason why we also need to protect children is that if you look at the history of the tobacco industry, they're constantly trying to advertise to very vulnerable groups. They're constantly trying to make smoking look cool. And we don't think that it's good that people are making profit out of death. People are dying across the world because of tobacco, because of the fact that cigarettes are so dangerous and damaging. And we need to take steps, like we have with other illegal substances, and Jess again is going to detail this in her speech, to ensure that things are actually better. And my final point is about what happens in the developing world, because there are big harms to the countries that produce tobacco. If you look at a country like Malawi, which produces 2% of the world's total tobacco crop, there they focus their industry so much on tobacco as a cash crop because they can sell it overseas. But it doesn't do anything to help development in Malawi itself. It doesn't help the people of Malawi. What they need is sustainable agriculture. They need to make sure that they have a rounded economy that's able to deal with fluctuations in global markets, and that's not happening because they're putting all their eggs, as it were, in the tobacco basket. But also, we think the environmental cost of tobacco is massive. If we look at deforestation in Brazil, huge areas of the rainforest have been destroyed in order to allow tobacco plantations run by large international corporations like Philip Morris to build very, very big tobacco farms. So to conclude my speech, what have I told you so far for the proposition's case? Well, we've explained what the ban would be, a complete ban on production, sale and distribution of all tobacco products. We've explained that the harms are very clear, that it's bad for people's health, it's also bad in terms of second-hand smoke, and it's something which currently isn't being regulated enough. And I've also shown you that we don't think it's really ethical anymore for these vulnerable groups in society, particularly children, to have profit made out of them by tobacco companies who essentially are killing off huge numbers of our population. Moreover, it's damaging the developing world. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge you to propose our ban on smoking.
Let's have a closer look at the performance of Proposition 1 Speaker, Mr. Alexander David Just's speech. This speech was a speech that is exemplary of how to deliver a good Proposition 1 speech. We can analyze this speech in terms of role fulfillment, and we will look at each of the different elements that a good speech should have: good style, good strategy, and of course good content. Firstly, in terms of strategy, it is a speech that was particularly well structured and that was well timed, and there was also a very good thematic grouping of the different arguments in terms of the case split. The first speaker suggested that he would speak to the practical harms, and the second speaker in the team who deal with the more philosophical issues. That is an example of excellent strategy because the relevant arguments were grouped in two different speeches. In terms of style, the speech was delivered very clearly and also with great rhetorical force. In terms of content, however, there was a mixture of both very good analysis, but also some analysis which could have been improved on. An example of excellent content was the evidence that Mr. Just used to justify why there are individual and public health harms that will continue to be associated with smoking unless smoking is in fact banned. The use of statistics and the analysis of the different examples where these harms happen is an illustration of how to use examples and statistics and evidence to justify a general claim in debating. Perhaps, however, in terms of constructive criticism, the speech suffered from a selection of too many different categories of harm that he tried to analyze within 5 minutes. So, for example, the analysis of the harm that he suffered in the developing country as a result of tobacco being produced was an argument that was perhaps dispensable, which the team didn't need to use at all. However, despite the fact that this argument wasn't well developed, on the whole, this speech demonstrated the importance of excellent content, in particular empirical evidence being used to back up general claims about the particular harms that are involved in a particular policy.
I now call on the first speaker from the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, the core of the debate about banning smoking is about the role of the state. And we think the role of the state and the role of the government is to only regulate where there is a clear harm to other people. We don't think in this case there is. Where there is an extreme harm to an individual, we don't think smoking counts as this. And we think that where government should regulate, they should try and take the path of least resistance. We don't think you can ban smoking effectively, ladies and gentlemen. In my speech today, I'm going to tell you about two things. First of all, showing you that the harms of smoking aren't as significant as Alex has tried to claim. Secondly, I'm going to look at freedom of choice and show you why freedom of choice is incredibly important in this debate. Rose, in her speech, as the second opposition speaker, is then going to look at minimising the harms in this debate, about other ways to minimise those harms through regulation, and secondly, about the fact that the ban is simply impossible to enforce. But before I go on today and give you my own substantive material in this debate, what I want to do is I want to look at the arguments that you got from the first proposition speaker, because we think there are big problems with them. First of all, he told you that there was a big risk to public health from smoking, that smoking kills. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we say that yes, that's true, but smoking also brings a huge amount of pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. And we say there are lots of activities that we allow in society that are quite dangerous, that bring a huge amount of pleasure. For instance, we allow people to bungee jump, despite the fact that we know it results in a number of deaths every year, ladies and gentlemen. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that in society we do allow
we do allow people to potentially harm themselves in order to bring pleasure. Secondly, Alex, no thank you. Secondly, Alex told us about vulnerable people, and he told us that, for instance, passive smoking was an example of how smoking harmed the vulnerable. Well, what do we say to this, ladies and gentlemen? We say to you there are better ways than the proposition's policy of overkill of dealing with the harms that come to vulnerable people. No, thank you, sir. We say you can ban smoking in limited areas, so in front of children, in the vicinity of schools, in public places. But we don't think their policy of banning tobacco everywhere and in all forms in any way solve those problems. Thirdly, looking at the developing world, we say that they told you about cash crops on the side of the proposition. Cash crops are essential to drive the kind of growth that you see in countries like Malawi. They get huge amounts of their GDP from producing tobacco. We think it's of a huge benefit to them, ladies and gentlemen. They told us about deforestation. No thanks. We think there are bigger reasons for deforestation in Brazil, say, for instance, farming or logging. We don't think tobacco is a great example on that case. So we think we're ahead in this debate. We think we've destroyed the arguments you've seen from the proposition. But what arguments am I going to add to this debate? Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you that smoking isn't inherently harmful in a way we should regulate. We say that tobacco, for instance, isn't inherently addictive. Lots of people can smoke for a number of years without becoming addicted to cigarettes. We say, on that instance, it's not harmful. Secondly, within this, we say it doesn't alter your mental state. It doesn't in the way that illegal drugs such as LSD alter your mental state. No thanks. No, thank you. But we also say that the actual harms they've identified aren't certain. Lots of people smoke well into their 80s without contracting lung disease, ladies and gentlemen. Go on, sir.
Come on. Andrew, 26% of males in the developed world die because of cigarettes, and that's a proven fact. Are you working for the tobacco lobby, or do you have any evidence to back up your claims that smoking is actually good for you?
Sir, we're not saying that smoking is good for you. We say that in society there are lots of things that are very bad for you, but we allow you to participate in those things because it doesn't necessarily harm you. Ladies and gentlemen, we say in society you're not allowed to self-harm because if I slit my wrists, I will definitely cause harm to myself. We say we don't regulate on the grounds of probable harms that something might be harmful. We all say there are parallels, and this is our example, ladies and gentlemen. There are parallels to existing harms in society. We allow sunbathing. Sunbathing has a very high probability that you will get skin cancer at some point in your life. But we don't ban people from going to solariums to sunbathe, ladies and gentlemen. So we say if they want to ban tobacco, they also have to ban harmless activities like sunbathing. No thank you, madam. But the second argument we want to talk to you in this debate is about freedom of choice. Because we think people can consent to certain harms. We say that people do harmful things all the time in society. They do things like work. They told us on the side of the opposition, on the proposition about duress. We say often you can have financial pressure put on you to participate in a particular activity. We say all the time you can consent to these kind of harms in society. Smoking, ladies and gentlemen, we insist on the side of the opposition, is a rational choice. In most countries in the world, there are adverts placed on cigarette packets that say smoking has a high probability of killing you. Smoking has a high probability of causing lung disease, ladies and gentlemen. We say you are provided with that kind of information as an adult to make rational choices. We say that advertising, for instance, on television is banned, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, you do have the kind of information you need in this debate to make the rational choice. We also say there's freedom of choice for firms. We say in a commercialised society, in a market environment, firms should be allowed that kind of freedom to produce products that only have probabilistic harms, ladies and gentlemen. We should only regulate what firms produce when there are clear, certain, identifiable harms to individuals. So what have we told you in this debate? We've attacked the case made by side proposition. We've attacked their public health argument, we've attacked their vulnerable people argument, and we've attacked their argument about the developing world. But we've also added substantive new arguments. We've told you that smoking isn't inherently harmful, and we've told you that freedom of choice is an important value that should be protected in this debate. On those grounds, we firmly urge you to stand in opposition. Thank you very much.
He had a good introduction, he was organised, and he structured how his case was going to be developed, and indeed how his partner was going to speak for the opposition side. The first thing that he did, which is vital to any first opposition speech, is give rebuttal to the substantive arguments that I had presented in my speech. And Andrew did a good job of going through each of the major points that I focused on, but sadly he missed out one of the big arguments in the debate, and this cost him strategically. A lot was made in the debate, as Eusebius has mentioned, about the groups who were harmed by cigarette smoking. And I felt that Andrew didn't really deal with the argument about vulnerable groups in enough depth, as it had been dealt with in quite a lot of detail by me in my speech. He then went on to give the major evidence to support his side. And in terms of his content, the philosophical arguments were very strong, and they sounded good, but what they sometimes lacked was some real evidence. He didn't have necessarily statistics to back up his argument that cigarette smoking was just a probable harm. It was something that might cause you to get illnesses. And this led to one of the first weaknesses in the opposition team in terms of how their case line was developed. Because initially, Andrew said that he thought that cigarettes were something which were harmful, but which it was okay for people to smoke because it was a pleasurable activity, and they were able to deal with those harms and make a decision about them. He then slightly contradicted himself by saying later in his speech that he thought the harms that cigarette smoking gave individuals were only probable. And although he didn't back this up, it did lead to a slight tension, which then, as we'll see as the debate goes on, meant that the opposition were on slightly shaky ground towards the end of the debate as to exactly what their team line was as far as harms versus the individual making an informed choice.
I now call on the second speaker from the proposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What Andy said in his speech was that our arguments were overkill. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the overkill in this debate today is the tobacco industry. It's the number of people that die because of smoking every year. We think it's egregious, and we want to ban it. Alex talked to you about the harms caused by smoking. He talked to you about the public health risks, about how the tobacco industry targets vulnerable groups, and he talked to you about the developing world. What I want to talk about in my speech, Mr. Speaker, is I want to talk to you about the role of the state in protecting their citizens. And I also want to talk to you about the cycle of addiction and how that undermines any arguments we might hear from side opposition about choice and about freedom. The first thing I want to talk to you about is about the role of the state and how the state has a role in protecting people against harms to themselves and against harms to other innocent people. What we would say on side proposition, Mr. Speaker, is that one of the roles of the government is to protect people. That's why we come together in societies and we decide to live together as groups, as opposed to living on our own in the woods or in a cave. Because we think, no, thank you, sir, that when people live together, we can provide collective goods for people. We can provide them with hospitals, we can provide them with welfare, and we can help other people out. The other things that governments do in order to help people is that they restrict our choices. No, thank you, madam. Why do governments restrict our choices? Because side opposition has told us that it's so important that people be free to do whatever they want. Well, lots of times what we would say on side proposition with an issue like smoking, when you engage in certain choices, these can go against your self-interest. No, thank you, sir, I'm just getting started. What can often happen is that these choices can cause you irreparable harm. They can cause you permanent harm. And we think that in these cases, the government sometimes has a role to step in and say, we don't think that's an appropriate choice. We think that we do this all the time in society. Governments around the world force their citizens to wear seatbelts when they're driving in cars. Lots of people, no thank you, sir, would like to say, well, I think I'm free to choose to drive around in a car really, really fast and not wear my seatbelt. The government steps in and says, no, we're going to protect you against the possibility, no thank you, madam, of harming yourself. We also do this with regards to drugs, and we think this is a particularly good analogy to smoking. Governments don't allow you, usually around the world, to do drugs like cocaine, to do meth, to do LSD, to do heroin. We don't allow these drugs because they cause you irreparable harm. Madam. It does, and I'll take you in a second, sir, infringe your initial choice to do that drug, but what we believe is the harm that it causes you and the harm with smoking that it causes to other people by secondhand smoke is so great that we think it's appropriate in that case to limit that initial choice. Yes,
but, madam,
sir.
do you not think this is a proposition case for banning sunbathing? It has the same kind of harms. Why wouldn't you ban it?
I'm going to deal with this argument that you made in my rebuttal. But what we think on side proposition is that you can't win this debate on side opposition by giving us examples of other things you might ban because they're bad for you. That's a completely separate issue. Maybe sunbathing is really bad. Maybe there are lots of other things that aren't good for people, and maybe we should ban them. We can do that another day. But at the point at which sunbathing causes 26% of male deaths in the developed world, then we'll start talking about it. Maybe then we'll have a stronger case for banning it. The second thing I want to talk to you about in my constructive argument is about addiction. Because what we think when we are talking about freedom of choice, side opposition told us, and I'm doing some rebuttal here in this argument, that people should be free to consent to harms. They should say, I want to smoke and I know it's really bad for me, but I'm making that choice and that should be okay. But what we say on side opposition is that a lot of times that first choice to pick up a cigarette isn't a free choice. It's not a fair choice and it's not an informed choice. Alex told you in his speech that a lot of times children are influenced by advertising that's very coercive. A lot of times people smoke, no thank you madam, because they think it's cool. A lot of times adults will start smoking because they don't have the proper amount of information about how smoking is really bad for them, and this happens a lot in the developing world. So a lot of times we don't think that's a free and fair choice. Once people become addicted to smoking, the additional decisions to pick up a cigarette and keep smoking are not free and fair choices. It's a biological impulse. They're addicted to a substance and they can no longer say, I no longer want to pick up that cigarette. It's a very hard drug, and we think that's important to consider, that these are people who are sick and they're people who have a disease. Very quickly, I want to consider what we heard in Andrew's speech on side opposition. He told us that the harms of smoking aren't that bad. He said that if you're going to ban smoking, you also have to ban things like bungee jumping that might also cause harm. I've already given you 2 responses, but I'm going to say them again, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, we think it's a matter of degree. At the point at which bungee jumping causes 1/4 of male deaths in the world, we think that's a strong case for banning something. We don't think that bungee jumping does that right now. But the second thing he talked to us about was this notion of freedom of choice. He told us people should be free to consent to harms, people should be able to engage in dangerous jobs. I told you about how these choices aren't always free, but I think it's also worthwhile to point out that a lot of times we do regulate the labor market. We don't let people have jobs in any industry at all. I'm not allowed in most countries to climb up a skyscraper to fix the skyscraper without any kind of ropes around me because it's dangerous. For all these reasons, we on side proposition are proud to propose.
Jess's speech is a good example of excellent philosophical analysis. First, let's talk about the content of her speech. She dealt with the philosophical basis of the proposition's case, and she argued that it is the role of the state to sometimes protect citizens. One example of how to explain a stated argument very well is to give an analogy. And Jess's analogy about living in the cave or in the woods was a good example of how to package a potentially complex principle and make it more easily understood for a wider audience. And that was the heart of her content and her contribution to this debate. However, there were some strategic weaknesses in the speech that are quite instructive. Firstly, Jess decided to give her major rebuttal at the end of her main speech rather than at the beginning. Speakers should avoid doing that and offer their rebuttal first before making a substantive contribution towards the debate. Secondly, in terms of timing, Jess's speech was badly timed because she did not take into account that over 5 minutes, less time needed to be proportioned to each of the different elements of the speech. And finally, in terms of style, while the speech was delivered with conviction and with clarity, this is an example of how body language can sometimes be distracting, where Ms. Jess, if one looks closely again at the video, had one of her arms behind her back and used the other arm to gesticulate in a manner that did not necessarily enhance the overall performance.
I now call the second speaker from the opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to talk to you about today is primarily about the role of the state, because we think that we on the opposition agree with a lot of the things that the proposition have said. We do agree that the government has a role in protecting people, and we do agree that sometimes harmful things can be bad for you. But what we don't agree with, ladies and gentlemen, is that the first thing that you should do is ban these harmful things. We think the government should do everything in its power to make the most choices available to its people that it can, within that context of being able to minimize harms and to protect people, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we on the opposition here think that there are lots of other things you can do to prevent the harms that smoking causes without banning it. And I'm also going to talk to you about why actually banning it causes more harm than it does good. So, first of all, I want to look at what Jessica said. Jess talked about the idea that government is there to protect people. And we think, yes, that's true, ladies and gentlemen, but there are lots of things that the government does in protecting people that don't necessarily mean an outright ban. So, for example, alcohol is just as harmful as smoking. It causes just the same amount of deaths as smoking does, if not more. That's why, we restrict who can drink alcohol. We say people over 18 or over 21 should be allowed to drink alcohol. We restrict how much alcohol you can buy in certain places. And we also restrict the volume of alcohol in alcoholic drinks. So you don't let people drink 100% alcohol. You make sure that it's only about 40% in their drinks. There are lots of other things we can do. Jess also talked about this idea of addiction, that we should ban things that are addictive. Well, every morning, ladies and gentlemen, I wake up and I drink a cup of coffee because I don't feel that I can have a full and productive day without my coffee. I then start to feel like I need coffee. No, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And my drinking of coffee, which can be harmful, it can cause heart attacks, no thank you, and things like this, becomes an irrational choice. But what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is we can provide you with lots of examples that the proposition are being inconsistent with in saying that they ban smoking but not other things. But on top of that, no thank you, we say we make irrational choices all of the time and the government doesn't restrict them. I'm doing debating, ladies and gentlemen, because my friends do debating. That's not necessarily a choice that I would make completely freely and fairly. And finally, on this point of advertising, we say there's lots of information provision out there that counteracts the persuasive advertising that you have, like government health campaigns about how smoking is bad. And on top of that, if you have a problem with advertising, ban advertising. Don't ban the act of smoking. So let's move on, no thank you, and look at my main arguments. First of all, we think that there are less invasive ways of dealing with this. If you have a problem with something, ladies and gentlemen, there are lots of things you can do just before you ban it. For example, driving, ladies and gentlemen, is dangerous. If I drove without a seatbelt on the wrong side of the road, drunk, and at 150 miles an hour, it is very likely that I would cause a lot of deaths and pose a great risk of harm to myself. Which is why we make people wear seatbelts, because that's the less invasive way of doing things. We don't ban driving, ladies and gentlemen. We make it as safe as we possibly can. No, thank you. And we think this is an analogy with smoking. You can make smoking as safe as you possibly can by restricting the tar content, by restricting, no thank you, the nicotine content, by stopping you smoking in front of children, no thank you, in restaurants, in pubs, no thank you, and banning advertising aimed at children. There are lots of other things that you can do. There are ways of restricting smoking and preventing the harms that the proposition are complaining about. I'll take you in a second about this, without actually having to ban things and restrict people's choices to smoke altogether. Yes, please.
Wearing seatbelts is not inherently bad for you. Bad chemicals inside cigarettes of whatever quantity is inherently physiologically bad for you.
Okay, thank you. But we do think that there are other things that are inherently physiologically bad for you that you can still do. And we think that by restricting your freedom of choice, ladies and gentlemen, that's just as much of a harm as the smoking that you do. And the proposition have to prove why, in every circumstances, that smoking is harmful for you. Because we don't think that in every circumstance it causes cancer or it causes cancer to your children. So finally, let's look at this idea of problems with enforcing. Because we think the ban is very difficult to enforce. Either, ladies and gentlemen, it becomes like things like cannabis, where lots of countries have banned that, but the penalties are so low that people still continue to do it. And we think this is a problem that the proposition have, is they haven't told us what they would do to people if they caught them smoking, what they would do to people if they caught them importing cigarettes, ladies and gentlemen. So we think, in order to make it work, the penalties have to be very harsh. But if those penalties are very harsh, ladies and gentlemen, you have lots of problems, because so many people smoke. You're criminalizing a great number of people in society. That's practically problematic, because it means lots of people might have to go to jail. And it's also a problem in principle. We think it's also a problem for people's culture, because lots of people have a culture for smoking, and we also think that if you don't have it regulated, you make cigarettes more dangerous because people aren't making them the way the government wants them to. So for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose.
Rose's speech in second opposition was a good example of how important timing is in a debate. Rose made the strategic mistake of spending a little bit too much time in her case dealing with rebuttal, and that meant that she wasn't able to fully explain some of her strongest arguments that she was making for her side. In terms of dealing with the rebuttal, Rose was a very powerful speaker in terms of style. She had an excellent change of tone as she was dealing with different points, and she varied her language appropriately in order to try and convince the audience. The one slight criticism we might have of her rebuttal to Jess's point about addiction was that she made the argument quite personal by talking about how much she liked drinking coffee. Now, although this was a good example of how you can use an analogy to a different situation to explain an argument, it didn't really have the depth and sophistication that Jess's argument had about how addictive nicotine can be. And that was something that the opposition really had to deal with at that point in the debate. As far as the rest of Rose's speech went, she made some strong arguments towards the end of her speech about how important it was to remember that when smoking was banned, it wouldn't necessarily be effective. However, the way that she prioritized her material meant that it wasn't until the very last 20 seconds of her speech that we heard some of the key arguments that the opposition often make in this debate about how dangerous smoking would be in a world where it was banned by the government. She mentioned the fact that cigarettes would appear on the black market and that would make it more dangerous for smokers. She told us that people wouldn't be able to give up smoking, and so they continued to smoke even more dangerous cigarettes. But unfortunately, this all happened after the final bell had sounded. And so in terms of the judges assessing how much it was part of her speech and how central it was to her case, she dropped the ball slightly. There was also another small but important contradiction which came up, and this was another strategic weakness for the opposition side, in terms of the fact that Rose initially referenced the free choice argument as being central to her team's case. She argued that people should be able to make the decision to do what they like with their own bodies. However, at one point in her speech, she mentioned that regulation of smoking was also philosophically acceptable, and argued that there should be labels on cigarettes, that certain cigarettes should not have as much tar, and that the smoking in public places was something which the state should be able to restrict. So overall, it was a strong stylistic speech, but it lacked the content and strategy that she needed to keep the case going for her side, and that was mainly a function of the timing problems.
I now call the third speaker from the proposition.
Mr. Speaker, there are three important questions that this debate hinges on. The first question is whether or not smoking is genuinely harmful. The second question is whether or not individuals should be allowed to make choices even when those choices are harmful for those individuals. And the final question is what the role of the state more generally should be in the lives of individuals and the decisions those individuals make. I'm going to summarize this debate by showing why the proposition side have been stronger on each of those three questions. But before I do so, I want to respond to the last speaker's speech and one or two of her arguments that fall outside of the main three clash points. Now, the first thing that we heard from Rose was this idea that, well, you know, there are all sorts of things that are dangerous for us, such as smoking, such as alcohol, and all sorts of other activities. That argument, unfortunately, doesn't work for a number of reasons. Firstly, the evidence shows that, in fact, deaths related to smoking account for more than deaths accumulated through other activities, such as drinking, HIV, car deaths, all put together, such as in the state of Pennsylvania. But secondly, the entire opposition line pointing towards other possible harms is a complete irrelevance in this debate. Each of these different categories of harm have to be debated on their own merits. Should it turn out that more things ought to be banned, then we will be happy to do so if the evidence suggests that that is sensible. The second thing she tells us is that we can minimize the harm. For example, it's possible to have less nicotine or tar content. Well, that argument doesn't work because those substances are inherently bad for you. It's not the amount of those substances that are bad, it's those substances in and of themselves. And that's why that argument doesn't quite work. And finally, there's a philosophical contradiction at the heart of her argument. Because on the one hand, she says a state should provide citizens with as many choices as possible, but then she says we've got a counter policy where we can make it a little bit restrictive by having certain kinds of cigarettes on the market, and I'm afraid you can't have both. But let me get back to the first overall major question. Is the harm genuine? We heard from Alex a bunch of factual information why, in fact, the public health costs are very high. He told you, for example, how across Europe and in America, we have a lot of bans on smoking in public precisely because the evidence, as far as medical opinion goes, is crystal clear that smoking kills. you have a lot of cancer deaths and other related deaths because of smoking. So from an objective, factual point of view, the harm medically to the individual is quite clear. What is the response from the opposition to this major claim by Alex? Well, it's kind of pleasurable. The fact that an activity is pleasurable is irrelevant if the harm is so great that in fact you are risking death, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why the bungee example, I'll take you in a second, doesn't work, because bungee jumping has potential risk involved, whereas smoking is inherently risky. They're two completely different examples. Don't you agree, sir?
What do you think, sir, the inherent harm to smoking one cigarette is?
So the problem with that argument is that you don't understand the addictive quality of smoking, which Jess spoke to quite well in her particular speech. It's precisely because smoking is often started on one cigarette, because it's kind of cool to do so if you're a young person, and then you end up being addicted to it. It's inherently addictive in a way in which an activity like bungee jumping is not, besides the fact that bungee jumping is not inherently bad for you. So that point of information doesn't work. The second major question then was, should individuals be allowed to make decisions about what to do even when the choice they will exercise is bad for them? And we say that there's already a precedent in societies across the world for the government sometimes to make decisions on your behalf where it is in your own interest. The second speaker from opposition concedes that point when she points to the example of wearing seatbelts. Even if you don't want to wear a seatbelt, that law is enforced. The principle behind enforcing it is that it is good for you to be forced to do certain things that are in your own best interest. And what we say is where the medical evidence is clear that in fact you will self-harm and you will harm other people, then in fact we can enforce this particular restriction on your liberty. So what they have to show is that in fact we should not have any restrictions on liberty, and clearly that is something which by the second speaker's own example is not something they believe in. Which leaves me then finally with the broader question of the role of the state. And here we gave you two very different arguments. The first speaker spoke quite convincingly on our side about how it's important for the state to protect vulnerable groups like children and like workers in certain conditions who don't have an option of applying for different works because they are vulnerable and they need those job environments. Those job environments have got to be made as safe as possible. And the medical facts are that deaths related not just to smoking oneself, but also to passive smoking are so great that we need to protect these vulnerable groups by having a general ban against smoking. Secondly, we also talks about the importance of protecting citizens from themselves in terms of self-harm. So when we look at these vulnerable groups, we look at children, we look at workers under certain conditions, what do we hear from the opposition? Absolute silence about whether or not these rights of these vulnerable groups matter. What we say is they do matter, Mr. Speaker. And so I urge you in the strongest possible terms to side with the proposition on three grounds. Firstly, because the harm is genuine. Secondly, because certain kinds of choices are non-choices effectively and should not be exercised. And finally, because it's important for the state to also protect vulnerable groups. For these three reasons, I side with the proposition.
The proposition third speech from Eusebius was an excellent example of how a third speaker has to identify the key themes in the debate. He took the themes and really crystallized them for his side, looking at all of the arguments that have been made by myself and by Jess, and explaining why they were still forceful and relevant to the judge's final decision in the round. He also had an excellent structure, and as opposed to some other speakers in this round, his timing was very effective. He moved through the material at a nice pace, allowing enough time to give sufficient analysis to every argument, making sure that he not only told people what the arguments were, but explained them and then backed up those points using the illustrations that had been made by the proposition side. He did slightly drop the regulation argument that Rose had brought up in her speech, but as we've seen, this was in the very last minute of Rose's speech, and perhaps Eusebius wasn't listening to her as he was writing his final notes to get ready to speak. It's always important to remember that you have to listen to everything that the other side says, and Eusebius was able to get away with this slight strategic mistake because of the fact that Rose wasn't able to develop those points substantially. Nevertheless, he should perhaps have made some reference to it in order to comprehensively knock that argument out of the debate and ensure a strong proposition victory. In terms of his style, Eusebius has a very powerful voice, but unfortunately in this round his hand sometimes bobbed around a little bit too much. And that's something which he might want to think about in terms of ensuring that his style doesn't become too monotonous in the future.
I now call on the third speaker from the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. But we think we've heard a lot of really interesting stuff from side proposition today, and we think they've come out with a really strong paternalistic theory of government. And what I'm going to do today, what's going to be my main point, is I'm going to look at some more detail at what the opposition's theory of government is, and what it is that we're trying to get across, and where we think the government should intervene, and where we think the government should allow us to balance between different sets of priorities, where we might want to balance some risks against having some pleasurable experiences during our life, because we think that's a really important thing. But what I'm going to do before that is I'm going to look at three areas that I think the proposition have brought up. This idea of tobacco being harmful, this idea of the developing world, and the importance of regulating and trying to benefit the developing world most to the alleviation of this cash crop problem. And lastly, this assertion that you can't have a rational choice for a variety of reasons to take part in smoking. So first of all, onto this idea of tobacco being harmful. But what they've told you, ladies and gentlemen, is that they think that tobacco and smoking is an inherently harmful exercise. And we say, no thank you, Alex, not at the moment. We say that we don't think it is inherently harmful exercise for a variety of reasons. First of all, we think in the short term, the act of smoking one cigarette isn't an axiomatically damaging thing for you to do. We say there's no guaranteed negative health consequences, no thank you sir, of you smoking one cigarette. We think in the long term, even if you do get addicted, there's no definite harms to you, which I think Andrew brought up very well in his speech. We say that there's no definite harms that you will, no thank you, that you will have to incur because that you smoke in the long term. And we think lastly, we think about, no thanks, not at the moment, you serious. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to reduce the harm as much as is possible, what you don't do is ban smoking completely and lose your ability, no thanks Alex, to regulate all of these tobacco products, which we think if people are addicted to, they will take anyway. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, the best way to alleviate these kind of harms and these negative health consequences is to have some kind of controls over the cigarettes that you produce, to make them as low risk as possible, which we think we can do this within our system of government, which I'm going to explain later, without making a contradiction. But we think the best way of alleviating lots of these health harms is to retain control over cigarettes. Secondly, they've had this idea of what's best for the developing world. Mainly, what they've said is the idea that cash crops, such as tobacco, are negative for the growth of developing world economies. And we say, in fact, they're extremely positive. Because we think, no thank you, Alex, we think they give developing world economies a huge amount of resources with which to fund their own development and to move into other areas. Yes.
Do you think it's good that all of Malawi's money goes to Philip Morris, the big tobacco corporation, and these people can't even eat the tobacco that they're making?
No, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we think, first of all, that they can't eat one of the things they produce isn't really an argument against them producing that thing. And second of all, we think that Malawi gets lots of taxation money from Philip Morris's operations within their country. So we think they, no thanks, guys. So we think that Malawi gains a lot in that way. And we think lots of Malawians get jobs from producing a cash crop as well. So we think that's a good thing. So we don't think cash crop production is axiomatically bad. And lastly, we want to go into this idea of rational choice within cigarette smoking and choosing to engage in tobacco. Because what they've told you is that for two reasons, most people don't have rational choice when they smoke or when they take a tobacco product. The first reason that they've given you is that lots of the people who smoke and who are targeted by advertising are vulnerable groups. Sir. No thanks, Alex. And the second reason they've given you is that because lots of people get addicted to smoking, they don't have rational choice in the long term. Well, what we say to those, ladies and gentlemen, is firstly, the idea that you can't make a rational choice because you're a vulnerable socioeconomic group, we don't agree with. We think that just because somebody is poor, that doesn't compel them to smoke a cigarette. No, thank you, madam. Okay? And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what we say to that as well is that if people are vulnerable and if people do lack information, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that those people should be given more information to help them to better choose how they want to make their balance, rather than being prevented from doing this completely. And secondly, as regards to the idea of addiction, what we think, ladies and gentlemen, is that cigarettes are different from other kind of drugs, which are the examples that they've given you of this. Because we think cigarettes don't get you addicted automatically. They only become addictive if you smoke them over an extremely long term, and if you make a huge number of different free and rational choices. Whereas we think lots of other drugs like cocaine or like heroin become much more addictive to you the first time you take them. So you don't have a free choice going forward. So we think there's a much different issue here as regards addiction versus some of the examples that they've brought up. And lastly, I want to talk about what our theory of a good and a just government is. Because what they've come up with is they've come up with a series of ideas, like this idea that the government should protect our long-term interests. Well, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that governments should help us protect our long-term interests, but they should also allow us to balance our long-term interest in health against some short-term interests in pleasure, because we think that the government can't judge exactly what my conception of a good life is, so I should be allowed to balance those. So for all the problems that we've identified, and for our positive theory of what a good government is, I beg you to oppose this motion.
Let's now have a closer look at the performance of the opposition third speaker, James. The main role of the third speaker is, of course, to pick out the fundamental themes in the debate and to speak around each of those themes with a view to showing why your side was stronger on each one of those dominant themes. James was correct to try to pick out the themes and to structure his speech around each one of those themes. However, he committed a major strategic error by focusing on an issue that had not actually been a dominant issue in the debate throughout. More specifically, he talked at length about why the argument about the developing world not benefiting in terms of agriculture is not a convincing argument on side proposition. James's analysis of why that argument was weak was excellent analysis. However, it was strategically not an important analysis to put on the table because it wasn't the fundamental basis on which the proposition policy had been built. So that's an example of good content that is not quite relevant, and therefore strategically it was a bad choice to spend so much time in the summary focusing on that particular issue. A second error that James committed was to shift the analysis of harm that had been presented by his two teammates. We heard in the speech by Andy that in fact smoking is harmful, but that there are other considerations why nonetheless citizens ought to be allowed to choose to smoke. But by the time we had heard the third summary speech, the claim was made that in fact smoking is not harmful. This is not only a tension within the team case, but in addition to that, unlike Alex's first speech, there was no counter evidence given to prove that in fact smoking is not harmful. So despite the fact that the speech was well structured, that an attempt was made to pick out the right themes, all of which is consistent with the duty that falls on the third speaker, the strategic errors made this a less than good overall summary speech.
I now call upon the opposition summary speaker.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition today are the enemy of your free choice. They are the nanny state against which we have to strike against. Today I want to tell you about three things that have happened in this debate: harms, choice, and efficacy. We think on all of these grounds the opposition win this debate. What happened about harms in this debate? First of all, the proposition identified harms to the individual. We say to this, the harms are not inherent. If you smoke one cigarette, you're not going to die of cancer. They're probabilistic harms, and in society, we don't regulate on the basis of probabilistic harms. Secondly, we say that they consent to these harms, that consenting adults can consent to the kind of harms you have in this debate. And thirdly, the harms are no greater than for other activities. Secondly, they told you about harms to others. We say, in this sense, ladies and gentlemen, you can minimise the harms to other people by banning smoking in public places or in front of children, rather than by banning it overall. What harms have we identified in the opposition? We told you that they criminalise a huge group of people who smoke at the moment. We think that's a massive problem. And we've told you, ladies and gentlemen, that they take away a huge source of wealth for the developing world. We think if you want to look to the harmful side in this debate, look to the proposition and side with the opposition on the issue of harms. Secondly, choice in this debate. We say, and it's always been our line as the opposition, that adults can consent to certain harms to themselves, so long as those are probabilistic harms, ladies and gentlemen. Cigarettes are probably the thing for which there is the most information in the world about the harms you incur to yourself, ladies and gentlemen. It's on the cigarette packets, it's in the media, it's all over. It's patronising for the proposition to say that poor people, that low socioeconomic groups can't consent. They have the information, they have the intelligence, it's their free choice, they should be allowed to make this decision. But also within choice, ladies and gentlemen, we say there are huge parallels. The proposition have tried to get around this by saying, oh, well, they've just picked examples of alcohol or sunbathing. We think these should be banned too. Don't let that fool you. The proposition case isn't just a case for banning smoking, ladies and gentlemen. It's banning a case for banning almost all of the things that make society fun, that make society livable, ladies and gentlemen. The proposition are the ones who are the enemies of your free speech. Finally, efficacy, because we think we win this debate on efficacy as well. The principle we think government should regulate by is, first of all, a method of least resistance, and second of all, a method that's credible and effective, ladies and gentlemen. We say if you want to go for least resistance, there are other solutions. Ban smoking in public places, ban smoking in the home, ban smoking in nurseries near schools. But what's the most important thing in this debate to remember? It won't work. There is no situation in which they can credibly ban smoking. The hundreds of thousands of people, the millions of people around the world who smoke aren't just going to stop, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think they have a credible way of implementing their policy. So what have we told you? We've told you that the harms that exist are harms to the individual to which people can consent. We're happy with that on the opposition. We've told you that consenting adults have the kind of information they need to make the relevant choices. We're happy with that on the opposition. And finally, we've told you the proposition's policy is simply ridiculous and ineffective. It won't work. On the grounds of harms, on the grounds of consent, and on the grounds of efficacy, we urge you in the strongest possible terms to oppose the ridiculous motion given to you by the proposition today. We urge you to oppose.
Finally, in terms of the opposition speeches, we can evaluate the opposition summary speaker, Andy. Andy's performance was an excellent example of how a summary speech should be delivered. In terms of strategy, he focused on material that was critical to try and prove the stronger arguments on the opposition side. For example, he reinforced the difficulties with regulation, and he also talked about how labeling of certain products can help to inform individual citizens to make their own choices. However, it was also, despite these strengths, an example of a speech that unfortunately inadvertently demonstrated the overall team strategy error on side opposition. Neither the argument about labeling of products nor the argument about regulation had dominated any of the major speeches. If that had been the case, then the opposition case on the whole would likely have been much stronger. So although this was an example of a clever speech that drew attention to strong elements of the opposition case that had not yet been tied down, nonetheless, this was material which ideally should have been developed much earlier in this opposition team case. So the speech by Andy, on the whole, is exemplary of a forceful, stylistically charismatic summary speech, but it's also an example of strategic error. One should not highlight important arguments in the summary speech. By then, these arguments should already have been made in the overall team contribution.
I now call upon the proposition summary speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Andrew stood up and told you at the end of this debate that we were trying to kill the fun from society. That's not true. We're trying to stop the people who are killing people who would like to have fun in their future, happy, healthy lives in a world where tobacco doesn't destroy children, doesn't destroy 26% of males in the developed world, and doesn't do a lot of damage to people in the developing world as well. So what I'm going to talk about in my conclusion is three things. Firstly, whether or not there is a genuine harm to smoking. Secondly, whether or not people have a genuine choice about whether or not they can just have one cigarette, which is apparently what most people in the world do. They have one cigarette and then they never smoke again. And finally, whether or not our ban is actually practical. So they told us generally that you have to have a probabilistic link to tobacco and smoking being a bad thing. Where are they getting their evidence from? The tobacco lobby? The science which they are supposedly suggesting shows that cigarette smoking and tar and nicotine and all the chemicals that you inhale into your lungs that gives you cancer, gives you emphysema, gives you asthma, which the Surgeon General of the United States, the World Health Organization, every government in the world that has a scientific body that regulates and puts labels on these products saying that they're bad, proves that cigarettes are dangerous. And yet they say, well, it might not be. It might be fine just to have one. It won't actually kill you. But we don't think that's true. We also don't think that they've shown that smoking doesn't harm other people. Because as Yubi pointed out, they've never dealt with our point about kids. They've never explained how they're going to stop secondhand smoke in the home, where you clearly can't regulate people smoking in their own homes. So children are definitely going to die. They've also then tried to tell us that, well, what we need to do in this debate is think about all the things in the world that are harmful, and we have to ban them all. The motion, ladies and gentlemen, is this House would ban smoking. Not this House would ban every activity that is dangerous. We have to prove to you why smoking specifically has to be banned. They've never explained why, logically, you'd have to ban bungee jumping or sunbathing, because at the moment, thousands and thousands of people aren't dying every year because they're bungee jumping. That's just not happening. If we wake up tomorrow and we find that people are becoming addicted to bungee jumping, that they're throwing themselves off buildings without ropes because they want the rush of bungee jumping, then maybe we'll step in and think about what we have to do. And that's the thing about choice. They've got this theory of government, which is essentially, according to James, pleasure. Pleasure is what we should be doing, you should do whatever you like, and we've got to balance the risk. But the government does restrict choice. It makes you wear seatbelts. It doesn't do what Andy says, which is to allow the market to decide. There are labour laws to stop you doing dangerous jobs. The addiction that Jess talked about in terms of nicotine is something which they've never really accepted. They claim that you just smoke one cigarette. We say that they don't really have any evidence to show that. And then they make this massive contradiction by saying, well, people have the knowledge of these drugs, they know what's going on, with the labels and stuff, but then the science is really bad and we don't know whether or not smoking is harmful. So people clearly don't have knowledge in a perfect way like they're setting up. And finally, in terms of whether or not this is practical, well, of course, there are going to be issues with regulating such a ban. But we say when you ban something like cocaine, what they'd have you do is let everyone just have 1 gram of cocaine just to see if they liked it. When you ban cocaine, people don't take as much of it. And that's what's going to happen under our model. There might be a culture of smoking, but we want to change it. And as far as their general philosophical idea that it's all about choice and we need to make sure people have all the rights to do what they want, if they're in favour of that, why did Rose stand up and tell you that they should restrict the market by making people have labels, by stopping people smoking in public places, by stopping people smoking in nurseries? They can't have it both ways. Essentially what the opposition have done is try to fight for the freedom of firms to kill people rather than saving the lives of children. The proposition summary speech was given by me, and it was a pretty good effort at a summary speech. It contained the 3 most important arguments in the debate and really showed why the proposition had won the case in terms of the content that they put out into the debate. It also contained quite a lot of powerful rhetoric, and while it was important in this debate to have statistics and evidence which were deployed throughout the debate by the proposition side, as we've explained, sometimes difficult issues, particularly philosophical issues, need to be highlighted to an audience and to the adjudicators in a way that's more easy and palatable for people to understand. And so the strong conclusion to this debate, where the rights of tobacco companies and the people to smoke were weighed up against the rights of individuals to be protected from smoke and the vulnerable groups, particularly children who were affected by this topic, was something which meant that the proposition could end on quite a passionate and high note. But there is a word of warning about this. Occasionally, debates where you have emotive issues can become too clouded in the language and the rhetoric of what people are saying. And that means you lose some of the objectivity that we need to see from speakers when they're actually giving us rational, analytical arguments why something is true. So although this was quite a powerful speech, it might have been a little bit over the top, and that's something which I need to think about in the future.
It's now time to adjudicate the debate and to decide which was the winning side in this particular debate. From the judge's point of view, the key questions that we ask ourselves is which side was more superior in terms of the role fulfillment and the burdens that both sides have to propose. The types of questions that we have in mind, for example, are whether or not a clear definition was put on the table by the proposition team, whether they had developed convincing, substantive arguments, whether there was good teamwork and individual role fulfillment. Conversely, on side opposition, we have to ask ourselves whether the model that had been presented was sufficiently attacked, or whether there was good response to the justifications that were offered in support of the model or the policy that a proposition team might have laid on the table. And again, as on side proposition, we also look closely at the individual role fulfillment of the team members on side opposition. Those are broadly the questions that we have in mind as adjudicators. Based on those questions, the adjudicators in this particular debate have come to a decision that there was a clear winning team. The winning team was side proposition. The justification for this particular decision is also clear. In this debate, there were 2 key issues at stake from the point of view of the adjudicators. There was a lot of back and forth debate about whether or not smoking is generally harmful. That was the first major issue that we had to evaluate. The second major issue was to look at the philosophical aspects of this debate, whether or not it is appropriate for the state, at least sometimes, to intervene in the autonomy or the decision-making of its citizens. Let's first look at the first issue. On side proposition, there was excellent evidence, particularly in the first speech, that demonstrated that it is accepted medical wisdom that indeed smoking is harmful. On side opposition, this was contended, but sometimes there was disunity in the opposition about whether it's really harmful or whether it's only a little bit harmful. In addition, there was no clear counter evidence to suggest that it is not in fact harmful. So on the first issue of harm, the proposition team was clearly more convincing. We then had to deal with the second issue, the philosophical analysis. On this issue, both sides were equally strong. The proposition team gave clear examples, such as the seatbelt case, to suggest that in fact there is a precedent for the state sometimes to intervene. On side opposition, there were equally persuasive examples of how already we allow citizens sometimes to make decisions even though there is some risk involved. However, in evaluating the second issue, opposition one had said that they would accept indeed that an invasion in one's autonomy would be acceptable if the harm is sufficiently strongly. So as judges, we felt that the only way we could adjudicate the second issue was to reference back to the first issue of harm. And given that first proposition was more convincing on harm, that meant that on the principled philosophical issue, their case was also ultimately more persuasive. Those were the two key elements on which the decision was based. A final, third issue was a question of strategy. Opposition had some good practical objections to this particular policy, as was evidenced by the final analysis on regulation in the second opposition speech. However, from a strategic point of view, that regulation objection didn't really dominate the opposition's problem with the proposition case. As a result, the argument was not a centerpiece and it was lost, and instead we had to focus on less important objections. So because of these three reasons, because the harm argument was won by the proposition side, and because the philosophical analysis, though evenly balanced, was more superior on the proposition side given the harm argument, and finally because of strategic weakness in terms of the priority of arguments, the proposition side clearly won this debate.